Hey everyone, let's all welcome James Bennett, who's going to tell us how to write the docs.
Hi. Much better. So I'm James. For those of you who are in the back and can't see me, I look like this. You may know me as the release manager for a Python web framework called Django, which sometimes it's been claimed has good documentation. I'm not going to talk about that. My day job, I work at Mozilla, one of the team behind the software platform that powers the Mozilla Developer Network, which is your all-in-one, everything you could ever want to know about web technology. We have articles, tutorials, demos, you name it. It's a gigantic repository of documentation on web tech. I'm not going to talk about that either. What I'm going to talk about is this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a sloth. Specifically, it is a brown-throated, three-toed sloth. Now, sloths are really fascinating animals. They're really amazing once you start reading about them. And I'm going to present you with several sloth facts. And if this isn't already a service that I can sign up for by text message, I hope that there is one by the end of the conference. So here's some facts about sloths. They can extract energy from very low nutrition food sources. Sloths eat leaves. Leaves have almost no energy in them, but they can manage to live off of this. This is an amazing evolutionary feat. They can do this because they have multi-part stomachs. It can take them up to a month to digest their food. That's a pretty long time. Sloths are also native to only two parts of the world, Central and South America. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, why is he talking about sloths? What do these have to do with documentation? Well, these are some software users, photographed in their natural habitat earlier. They come from all over the world. Software users have to be clever the way sloths are clever. Sloths have to extract nutrition from food that contains almost no energy. Users of software have to extract utility from code that is almost worthless and typically has very bad documentation. This is what you all have in common with sloths, and the fact that you've been able to get around this shows that you are just as much of an evolutionary achievement as the sloth. So you should feel honored to be compared to a sloth. Now, most software is like that. It's bad, it has bad documentation, it's hard to learn, it's hard to figure out how to use it. Some software is good. Some software has good documentation. Some software is easy to learn, easy to use, easy to work with. That's the kind of software that makes you look like this. This is a very happy sloth. His name is Herman. At least that's what the Wikipedia page says. This is what you want users of your software to look like. This is what you want to give them through your documentation. Because when you have happy users, do you know what happy users do? Happy users stay with you through version after version of your software, and when you release entirely new things, they will be more likely to try it out. Happy users promote your software through word of mouth. They will go around to all of their friends and all of their colleagues and say, "Wow, I found this great thing. It was so easy." And happy users, if you're open source, eventually contribute to your software. That's the killer feature. These are things that you want your users to be doing. These are things that your users do when they're happy. How do you make your users happy? Well, I did a very scientific study, and it turns out that user happiness correlates with the quality of your documentation. I absolutely have data to back this up. I swear this is like double-blind everything. So, how are we going to produce this great documentation? Because obviously you need it. Obviously your software needs it. Obviously your users need it. You need to make this happen. But how? It's hard. Now, there are a lot of tools, especially in Python. We can write doc strings in our code. We have Sphinx, we have PyDoc, we have Epidoc, we have tons and tons and tons of tools. I'm not going to talk about those. You can go find out the documentation tools. They're out there. They've got good documentation mostly. What we're going to talk about is how to make this happen from a writing perspective, from a what you need to do perspective. There is one thing, and if you take nothing else away from this talk, one thing that goes into writing great documentation. This is something that I haven't always done. I've been guilty of breaking this rule myself multiple times. The one thing to keep in mind when you're writing documentation, you are not up on high throwing knowledge down to those unwashed masses below you. You are just a little bit further ahead of them. You are reaching down a helping hand to pull them up. Keeping that in mind, letting that be your attitude as you write, keeps your tone friendly, keeps your tone conversational, keeps your tone feeling approachable. Your goal in writing documentation is not to make somebody an expert who can recite your API from memory. Your goal is to make someone who doesn't know how to do something into someone who does know how to do something. Your goal is to empower them through your documentation. So if you remember nothing else about writing documentation, remember this. Be like this sloth. This is a pretty cool sloth. Now, do you remember the second thing I told you about sloths? Who remembers it? What was it?
Multiple stomachs.
Sloths have multiple stomachs, just like ruminants. This is very important because it turns out software users are like this. They also have multiple stomachs. Turns out everybody learns a little bit differently. Some people like different learning styles. Some people need multiple learning styles just for one person. Not everybody learns the same way. Not everybody gets the same value out of the same piece of documentation. This means you need to have multiple things. Now, here's a list. You don't need to do all of these for every project you do. But here's some things you can do. Here's all sorts of different ways you can write and produce documentation. You can do tutorials. You can do examples. You can do an API reference. You can do downloadable samples. You can do in-depth guides. You can do all of these things. You don't have to do them all. But the more of them you do, the more different kinds of people, the more different styles of learning you're going to cater to, and the more people you're going to be able to reach. This should be your goal when you're writing documentation for your users who have multi-part stomachs. You want to feed all of their stomachs, not just one. When you're writing, keep your audience in mind, because there's a big difference between some of these if you're writing your introductory tutorial versus you're writing your API reference. Obviously, very different groups of people are going to be looking at these things. Different stomachs are going to be digesting them. So for example, if you're dealing with a new user is like a baby sloth. Baby sloths need lots and lots of care and feeding, so do new users. Be very careful in your style, assume nothing. Don't assume they know anything. Don't bury them in lots and lots of details right away. Give them the high level, give them the explanation of here's what we're gonna do, here's the next thing we're gonna do. Don't go into, well, we're going to build a WSGI app using a multi-threaded worker pool background. Don't do that. Tell them we're gonna build a website. We're gonna set up the web server. You don't need to smother them with the jargon right away. And you do need to give them lots of documentation and lots of examples, just the same way you need to give this baby sloth his bottle every couple hours. Otherwise, he'll starve and your users will run away from you, because nobody likes someone who kills a baby sloth. Experienced users are a little different. Experienced users, you can assume some things. Maybe they haven't used your software before, but they've used other software. Maybe they know some of the terminology. You can start writing your more in-depth guides for your expert, advanced users. You can use a little more of that. You can give lots and lots of links and cross-references and let them go back and forth and find things on their own. You can give them practical examples that they're going to just be able to copy and paste, or they're going to come by your site from a Google search saying, how do I do this? And oh look, here's an example of how to do this. So keep that in mind as you're writing, because different parts of your documentation are going to appeal to very different types of users, and you need to know who's going to be reading each one. Who remembers the third sloth fact? Sloths come from where? Central and South America. Now, what does that have to do with documentation? That's a tricky one. So, I'm going to back up a bit. I'm going to go through my first few slides again. I'm going to see if you notice a difference, okay? Bonjour, je suis James, c'est moi. Je travaille sur Django et pour Mozilla, et voici c'est un paresseux. Paresseux à gorge brune. Anybody notice the difference? How would you feel if you'd walked into this talk and that was really how I started it? Would you be a little confused? Maybe you wonder where you are. Maybe next year in Montreal that would work. But not here in California. So it turns out people from around the world may use your software. They may not speak English very well. It may not be their native language. They may not speak much English at all. Unfortunately, English is the worst language, except for all the others. 150 years ago, French was the international language that everybody used. Before that, Latin and Greek. Today, English is kind of the international technological language. So write your documentation in English, but keep in mind that not everybody who reads it is a native speaker. So, don't go overboard with your English vocabulary. Those of you who, like me, have liberal arts degrees, I unfortunately love semicolons too much. I need to stop using them. I have a problem. I can admit it. So just keep that in mind as you're writing. The person who reads it, go read some articles on the simple English Wikipedia and look at how they write that stuff. They can express very complicated ideas in very simple English that almost anyone from anywhere in the world can read if they have just a little bit of knowledge of the language. Now, how do we make this happen? How do we get this into our process? This is what developers look like sometimes when you tell them to write documentation. They get angry, they puff up, they're like, ugh, I can't do this. There are a couple tricks. The one that works for me, the one I have found work over and over and over again, is what I call documentation-driven development. Who's familiar with test-driven development? It's where you write the test first, then you write the code. Documentation-driven development is very much the same way. You write your documentation first, then you write the code that you just documented. The nice thing about this is you know how it's supposed to work. Would you ever really sit down and write some code without knowing what it was going to do? At your day job, would you sit down and implement a feature without at least discussing what it's going to do and having a ticket or something describing it? You're already writing some documentation. It may only be in your head. Write it down. Turn that into a spec. Turn that into what you're going to refer to as you write, so you know what it's supposed to do, and somebody else can come along later and read it and find out. And this really meshes well with something in the Zen of Python. It says, if the implementation is hard to explain, it's a bad idea. I can't tell you how many times I've run into this trying to write documentation for something and saying, wow, that's a really bad way of doing this. And it's much easier to throw out documentation than it is to throw out code at this stage. So it's much better to be doing it this way. And the converse, if the implementation is easy to explain, it may be a good idea. So if you find your documentation really flowing, you might be on the right way to do things. Final thing, and this is some projects that I've been involved with have had this policy, Django has this policy. If your patch doesn't have documentation, your patch doesn't merge. Make that part of your workflow and your documentation will improve immeasurably. We did that on Django. That's one way we've maintained quality for years. So, just don't go overboard. I will give my personal example. I wrote a module. It's 849 lines long and only 250 of them are code. The rest of it is doc strings. That's a little too much. You don't want to drown the baby sloth in milk. You just want to feed it appropriately and at the right times. Keep all this in mind. Keep this in your process. Write lots of documentation. Write good documentation. Make your users happy. That's all we ask you to do. Anybody have questions? By the way, if you want to know where I found all the sloths, there they are. But I like Herman. Is there a microphone? Okay. I guess the microphone's way over there.
So there's a lot of existing projects in the world that I would like to use. How do I convince them to do docs? How do I get them to just do the no docs, no merge as a starting point?
It is a lot harder to retrofit these attitudes, and what Jeremy's asking is, how do I get an existing project to adopt these kinds of things? It is a lot harder when a project already exists and is set in its ways. Usually, the way I would approach it is talk to them about the benefits, Talk to them about how they're going to grow their user base. And you really can point to the easier you make it, the more people are going to use this. Sell that as a benefit that you're going to have more users or you're going to have more customers. The easier this gets, the more people are going to want to use your software. That's the way to sell it, because that's what we all want, really. We want something that's easy to use, easy to learn, easy to work with. So sell that as the main point. That's the benefit. Yeah.
Django's documentation is so nice to me because it has this very narrative style to it, at least at first. Eventually it gets into more of an API documentation style, but the narrative seems so nice. And when we sit down at our company to write docs, I get stuck. I find that difficult. Did that come easier to you over time, writing that sort of narrative style documentation as opposed to very API specific?
Does writing narrative style documentation get easier with time? I don't know that I could say personally. My background is in philosophy.
Okay.
I'm used to writing sentences that span 3 pages. And I kind of have to tone that down when I'm writing technical documentation. But what I find a lot of the time is when I'm writing, and it doesn't have to be big, just like small examples. Every little example is a story. You're telling a user a story of how they can do something. So even if it's just a couple paragraphs, that narrative style can work really well. And having in your mind, step by step, the story that you're telling will often just make that flow automatically. Anybody else?
Anyone else? Last call?
Going once, going twice.
Right.
Oh, we got one. Last minute.
What kind of software do you have that helps with documentation so that you know that what you're writing is actually displayed in the documentation?
As far as getting things to display and knowing that everything works in the software tools, like usually I just use Sphinx. That seems to be what everybody in the Python world is using these days. But again, like tools come and go. A few years ago, Sphinx didn't exist. We wrote everything by hand in restructured text. A few years before that, we did other things. Honestly, the tool's been getting better, but I tend not to focus too much on any specific tool. I focus on the act of writing. So, and every once in a while I'll regenerate it, say from Sphinx source, and take a look at it and proofread.
Great. Well, thank you, James.
Okay. Thank you all.